Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started then. We'll start nice and easy. Can you just, tell us who you are and what you do here?
So my name is Evan Parker. I'm a PhD candidate at Tulane University in the Department of Anthropology. I'm an archaeologist doing my last field season of archaeological research based out of here in Oshkosh. So got like 6 weeks of excavation plan followed by a couple of months of lab work. It's going to be good.
How'd you get into archaeology in the first place?
It was kind of accidental. I think that's how it goes for a lot of people, and we just kind of somehow accidentally fall into this profession. But I always wanted to be an historian. That was since I was a little kid, I always wanted to just study history, and it was because I could go to all these Civil War battlefields. I grew up in Mississippi, so I could go visit all these Civil War battlefields, and it gave history a very tangible sense, right? That you could go and experience it, see these landscapes. And I didn't think about it at the time that was really kind of a proto form of doing archaeology. So I go to college, and I take history classes, and then I'm like, well, I might as well figure out what's going on before history happens. So I take an archaeology class with Dr. George Bay, one of the directors of this project. And I think it's pretty cool, so I take another class. Then I come down to Yucatan for a few weeks for a quick trip. Then I'm coming down here to do excavations. Then I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll go to graduate school for this. And then 7 years later, here we are. So, yeah, it was kind of an intersection of being able to discover history in a way, or rediscover history, I should say, in a way that historians, I think, simply couldn't.
So, at MPark, are you trying to rediscover history?
It's a tricky term, saying rediscover history, right? Because these items that we end up finding have been left behind, and people have known that they've been there basically since they were left behind. And so I'm coming here, and saying rediscovery is kind of a misnomer. It's really just kind of having the money, resources, and scientific knowledge to pull it out of the ground and adequately document the process of unearthing these things.
So, at MPark, is, your job mainly just excavation, or do you like doing more research?
So the archaeologists do tend to focus on certain things, and I think that I tend to specialize more in excavation, whereas some archaeologists might, for example, do survey and go out and map sites. Others prefer to work in the lab and analyze, or specialize in the analysis of stone tools, ceramics, that sort of thing. I've always liked to dig. Hacking my way through the jungle was never really my cup of tea. Yeah.
As I can imagine. So, given that you are someone who's more interested in, that aspect of it, how did you come to MPark?
I had a few options in terms of where I could do my dissertation research. So my advisor at Tulane University invited me to the site that he conducts research at in Guatemala, and I went there, and it was an amazing site. They find all these really beautiful stone hieroglyphic texts. They find these extravagant tombs, and it's very interesting archaeology. That said, I'd been doing work here for a while, and I feel like we were just kind of scratching the surface as to reconstructing the prehistoric record here. Whereas down in Guatemala, I think they've got a little better handle on it. So even the eras that we knew the most about here, I feel like there was still so much more to explore, let alone the periods of time that we didn't know much about, which is what I tended to focus on. So given that, and given how nice the facilities are here, how great the infrastructure is, the relationship that we enjoy with the government, all of these factors kind of crystallize and say, well, okay, this is a great opportunity for a dissertation. So that's kind of how I ended up here. Honestly, I never left. It's really more of what it was like.
So you made an interesting point that you commented on the interactions with the government. Could you explore that a little bit more?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I think Mexico does really well. and that is that the government plays a strong role in protecting prehistoric and historic sites, and that you have to receive licenses or permits to excavate or do any type of archaeological research. And it's good because that means you can apply a uniform standard of laws, regulations, and that there's professionals who can oversee that. And that leads to good outcomes for the archaeological record. In the United States, we kind of end up having more of a patchwork of laws and regulations, and this, in many cases, can lead to the destruction of the prehistoric record. So yeah, it's and this differs from country to country, and each country tends to have its own relationship with the archaeology within its borders. And I think there aren't too many other countries that have as strong a relationship to their history and prehistory as the country of Mexico does.
I may just interject, and please continue to look at Alec when you respond. Mm-hmm. As Tomas probably told you, our project has to do with the Puuc angels. If the government was so proactive, they took it upon themselves to do a task that should have been relegated by the government.
That's a really good question. I don't know the factual basis for that, or kind of what ended up leading these people to do this. Part of it might be due to the rural nature of Yucatan. That it's more difficult to protect sites that are located in rural areas, and that oftentimes the people who know the most about the sites, who are most familiar with them, are the people who've been living there all their lives, people who like the farmers. Now, does that mean that the government, could the government have been more involved? I think that's beyond the kind of my expertise or my knowledge to say. But I think it's a good thing to say that, well, these people have an interest in their own history and they're interested in protecting it, and that to some degree they can create a relationship with the government to help protect this. Yeah.
So given that these people have been living here their whole lives and that they take it upon themselves to protect this area, when we look at MPark as an institution that is representative of both Mexico and the United States, it's kind of an interesting dynamic of the mix of both, the very, as you said, involved government and the very uninvolved government. How does, those attitudes become reflected through MPark's research?
Well, basically all of the research that we end up conducting, right? It ends up being submitted to the government in the form of a really lengthy report with huge amounts of text, huge numbers of photos, full of technical jargon, and very dry language. That is kind of one facet of how you can project this information to authorities, to the public, however you want. But there are other methods as well, right? So on the one hand, we have the heavily involved government side. On the other end of it, you have the daily interactions, or the not so daily interactions with local peoples. And how we present that information, how we present these results of excavations, of mapping to them, is kind of another critical component of what we might do here. So for example, our project has had a long relationship with a small pueblo outside of Oshkoshkop called Yaxachen, where a lot of the workers for the site of Puuc, where they come from. And for a long time, we have tried to integrate educational aspects of our project to them, to basically say, like, this is, we know that this is your heritage, this is your cultural patrimony, this is what we've been finding this field season. And oftentimes it wouldn't even be, the American archaeologists or the Mexican archaeologists who would be leading these tours or informational sessions. It would be the excavators themselves, who are in some ways more knowledgeable than us about how some of these things, about the archaeological record. So yeah, I'd say that there are different facets, there are different ways that we can interact with the public, either very dry bureaucratic channels or these very informal methods.
You know, from an outsider's perspective, it sounds like, the strength in MPark is through this collaborative research with this outside pueblo. Could you comment a little bit more about the relationship that the researchers have here with the indigenous populations of Mexico?
I think it's a very good relationship. I count the people who I work with as friends. They ask us to go to parties, to graduations. They invite us over for dinner and for lunch. So I think that only viewing it as a cut and dried business relationship isn't correct at all. And this does happen on some projects where there isn't any type of integration between an archaeological project and local communities. One of my favorite kind of examples of this was we had this one undergraduate student who's working on my excavation team, and it was her first season doing archaeology, but she made friends with all these Maya men very quickly, and they heard that it was going to be her birthday on a given day in this week, and so they end up making her a cake, and then they hike it all the way up this 100-foot hill with candles, and we have a little birthday party there. I think it was something that I had never seen before in doing archaeology, and I think it really kind of symbolized that deeper relationship. Yeah.
It almost seems like you have like a family dynamic here, with the community here, and then that kind of extends out into the broader community.
And I think that's the way it should be too, especially if you're going to have a project that ends up being multi-decades long at this point. I think we're only a couple years out from being here for almost 20 years. So if you don't make those kinds of relationships, first of all, I think it's just you're probably not going to have a very good archaeological project, but second of all, I think you're kind of forsaking some of your responsibilities to the local community in terms of making sure that they're playing one of the more important roles in the unearthing of this data.
Could you just talk a little bit more about the responsibilities that as researchers you have to the local community?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question that I tend to have trouble grappling with, because I'm someone from the United States, basically of pure European descent. I don't really have any tangible ties to my heritage. I've never gone to Germany or England and dug up anything related to my ancestors. I've only done archaeology in the New World, which is a land that my ancestors colonized, and spread disease, tortured, enslaved, and still to a great degree kind of enact this asymmetrical power relationship. In some ways, archaeology can be viewed as kind of modern-day colonizers, I think. The fact that I'm coming here, I'm bringing a bunch of money from this country, and yes, I'm investing it in the local community, but I'm also taking this data, and I'll take it back to the United States, and to some degree, I'll profit from it, right? I'm going to get publications, it might give me a job, all this sort of thing. Now, this is nothing new for anthropologists. We've been dealing with this for a few decades now, and it's not just archaeologists who've come to recognize this. So bringing that knowledge to mind, or bringing it to bear in this particular case, say, well, all right, well, how can I not kind of be a filthy imperialist when I come down here to Mexico? How can I make sure that that I'm not pushing out local stakeholders, that I am listening more than I'm talking, and that these communities are adequately connected to their heritage, not adequately, but to the greatest extent possible, and that I'm just a facilitator of that. that I'm not that I'm not trying to be a great white savior or something of that nature, right? So it's a difficult kind of exercise, and it requires a lot of reflexivity, as well as hopefully good friends and colleagues will call you out if you're not being a good archaeologist in that regard. Yeah.
So how's that, again, look at Recepo, how's that manifested specifically in your own work? In
some ways this has proven a little bit more difficult for me just by virtue of the time period that I'm excavating in. So it's basically a time period from 800 BC to 350 BC. And we consider that to be a period that's culturally Maya, and we can certainly link it to the Classic period, which is by far the vast majority of the ruins that you see around you, the vast majority of the ruins that the angels, the Puuc protect, that's all Classic period, right? So creating a relationship between that deep of a past and the local community, I think, is more difficult, especially considering the fact that we only started finding this stuff a few years ago. As far as this particular site that I'm working at goes, it hasn't really lent itself to bringing visitors out there. So tangibly, I can't say like I've been giving tours to local school children, but it also is, 3 miles down a terrible dirt road as well. I think a lot of it's going to have to come around in terms of the way that it's presented to the public, all of the excavation data that we've gotten. So we've found some really amazing things at this site. And I say, well, all right, well, how can I responsibly disseminate this knowledge? Well, first of all, I'm not just going to run back up to the United States and start, shouting from the rooftops that, hey, look, we found this stuff. Instead, I'm going to, I'm going to consult with Mexicans first and hopefully release any type of information through those channels first, to where at least this information is presented as it should be, first of all, to a Mexican audience. Now, is that a huge amount of, or a huge step in terms of acknowledging the torrid past of archaeology? Not the best. Are there other ways that I can present this information or disseminate it or ensure that it's controlled by Maya people? Well, I am all ears. I'll say that. Yeah. It's kind of hard too whenever you're, I think, doing a dissertation and you're a graduate student to kind of juggle all these things as well. Hopefully this will be kind of more clarified as after the analysis is done and after I can take a step back and say, oh man, all right.
Well, it's been more than a decade since I finished my dissertation. I can tell you, these questions do not become any easier to grapple with. In fact, if anything, they become... The greatest travesty, I personally believe, is that guilt would prevent us from doing anything. And so another way to look at this, and I hope this is my long-winded way of asking your thoughts on this position, is that if anthropologists, archaeologists, if we, let's go ahead and use the first person plural, if we didn't do this kind of work, the simple fact of the matter is it wouldn't get done.
That's true. There is, I think, you kind of have to toe a certain line, right? The fact that if we're too busy being self-reflective or being afraid to do anything simply because of our past, the fact that we're carrying our past around with us, well, if no archaeology gets done, then that's not going to help anybody either, right? If you want to, in some ways, reconnect Maya people to their past, not doing archaeology is going to kind of be an impediment to that. So I don't know. I don't think I've gotten to the point where it's become paralyzing yet. But I am kind of self-conscious every day, and it might it can manifest itself in like little ways too. The fact of me like always getting shotgun in the truck. It's a little tiny thing, right? But the fact that I'm always the one riding shotgun, why should I be the one who gets shotgun? It's a stupid example, right? But that it is these little tiny things, and that they might indeed build up to a huge amount of anxiety, and that I stress out over do the excavations look good and this, that, and the other. But whenever you're also stressing out about the degree to which you're treating people with respect, decency, courtesy, it can add up. It can be a burden, but by the same token, like I'm here and I'm doing this archaeology, and if I'm not willing to accept that burden, then isn't that gonna kind of make me one of these terrible archaeologists of the past who did end up just going and stealing people's cultural patrimony? Maybe it's finding that middle ground, as it goes for many things, just finding that little middle ground there. Yeah.
Do you think that a lot of archaeologists, especially grad students and new archaeologists, do you think that all of them to a certain degree, or most of them, have to deal in one way or another with this anxiety, especially the ones that come from the outside, but also at the same time, people that are nationals specifically to archaeology? I mean, you think that this is a generalized thing for archaeologists, my archaeologists in this case?
I think some folks are a bit more aware of it than others. I think that's one thing that our project does do a better job of than some others, is kind of promoting an awareness of, who we are, who the community is, and what that relationship is between the community and the archaeologists. Now, there are other projects that don't do this at all, where the relationship is minuscule, basically, or it's just not a thing at all. Now, as far as Mexicans, I think that's a more complicated question. I think it depends on the background of the archaeologist. Are they indigenous? Were they raised in an urban area? Have they interacted extensively with indigenous people? Are there any divides, say, between Mexican archaeologists and indigenous peoples? And in many cases, you'll say that there will be. I can't speak to how to bridge those divides, because, boy, it's hard enough just doing it, being an American, But then you think, you think of like what's going on in the United States, and you say, all right, well, you have archaeologists who work in, say, where I'm from, Mississippi, and there is absolutely no relationship in many cases between indigenous peoples in Mississippi or Louisiana and the archaeology that's being done there. And the archaeologists aren't necessarily thinking about those sorts of things. And that's partially due to the fact that many of the Native Americans have been removed from those areas. But I think that there's such a disconnect between archaeologists who don't have ties to that heritage, and that just ends up creating this larger and larger gap. Whereas, at least I think you can say Mexicans have a really strong tie to their own heritage, and at least are going to be a little bit more aware of that relationship between the archaeology they're doing, their own heritage, and the background of indigenous peoples.
Last question, because we're running out of space and time and everything. Ironically, right before we talked to you, we spoke with young with these material remains. Going back to your example about Native Americans, that happens to be my area of expertise, such as it is, and that's a very common phenomenon. Is who cares about the past? When we're facing an uncertain present and future. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's that's something that I think you see bandied about a lot when people talk about archaeology, that the fact that it's irrelevant in a world where you have huge amounts of poverty, refugee problems, war, diseases, the fact that we shouldn't be wasting our time doing these sorts of things. And I'll admit, these thoughts cross my mind as I spend 60 hours a week staring at ceramic sherds, counting the tempering agents in the ceramic sherds, and I say, what is my connection to this? This is totally out of bounds for me. Well, that's just kind of the scientific minutiae. It's what you're looking at there. And as you begin to assemble those 60-hour work weeks on top of one another and the data becomes a more clear picture, that's whenever we begin to be able to say something significant about the past. And you say, okay, well, now that we can say something significant about the past, where does that lead us? There's a few different directions that we can go with this. Number one, we can utilize that information about the past to enhance the well-being of people in the present or future. So one of the things that I focus on for my dissertation is on the origins of inequality. Well, we live in a world full of inequality, right? And you maybe ask yourself, you say, well, is inequality a natural state of humanity? Are we meant to live with some people wielding power over others? And I think archaeologists are in a unique position of being able to say, well, this is how inequality develops through time. And seeing how that develops through time and how people create inequality in prehistory, I think has some implications for how we construct inequality in the present. And the degree to which inequality, for example, might lead to the collapse of civilizations, to widespread human suffering, to malnutrition. We can create these links, right? All right, so that's the first way. The second way is the fact that, I think to some degree, being connected to your history is empowering in and of itself. In that being able to not be rudderless or adrift in an open ocean, being able to tie yourself to the past, I think is good for your family, it's good for your individual well-being, and it's good for your community. And I think that archaeologists coming in and to some degree helping bridge this gap, I think that's one of the things that we can contribute most, and that's not irrelevant, and that's something tangible that archaeology can do for the world, and hence keep doing it if we can get those kinds of good tangible outcomes out of it. Yeah.
Let's end on that optimistic.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. I have 16 seconds left.
Wow, perfect timing.